a grape called Solaris, sea truffles, and Taco Tuesday in Sweden. This week, we're in Stockholm.
Traveling the world to bring you delicious dishes, tasty beverages, and interesting experiences. This is the Destination Eat Drink Podcast on the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
I'm Brent Peterson. Welcome to Destination Eat Drink, the travel podcast for foodies. This is where we find the best food and drink this world has to offer here on the Destination Eat Drink podcast, but also on the Destination Eat Drink YouTube channel and at destinationeatdrink.com. And this week, we're in Scandinavia for the best of Stockholm, Sweden. But first, if you like food and travel, be sure to share the podcast with your foodie travel friends. And if you'd like to support Destination Eat Drink even more, you can give a one-time or continuing contribution in any amount at buymeacoffee.com/destinationeatdrink. And thank you very, very much. Vincent Marcus is a foodie tour guide in Stockholm, Sweden for Food Tours Stockholm. He's also a sommelier and an advanced degree student studying marine food systems. Vincent and I have a wide-ranging conversation about Stockholm, including how to enjoy 20 daily hours of summer sunlight, the surprising wine culture of Sweden, new Nordic cuisine, marine food and sustainability, coffee culture, and dishes like pickled herring. How's that for an episode? All right, I'm starving, so let's eat.
Destination Eat Drink.
Vincent Marcus from Food Tours Stockholm. Great to get to talk to you today. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, Brent. It's great to be here, and thank you to all your listeners as well.
You know, it's height of summer now in Stockholm. It must be a glorious time to be in the city. Tell me, as we start off, just give me an idea. What are some of your favorite things to do in the summer in Stockholm to enjoy the great weather?
Yeah, well, us Swedes, we have a very kind of polar season. So winter is very dark, very gloomy, and quite cold. Summer is the opposite end. So you have, very long days, about 2-3 hours of darkness every night. So people tend to be outside as much as they can. And I'm definitely one of those people as well. So, anything from going into a park, having a beer, or which a lot of people do actually leave the city to the archipelago, for example. A lot of people here have summer houses, things like that, where you can kind of get away, get some nature, so on, which is quite close to the city.
When I see the videos of Stockholm, that's the thing that strikes me is that, right near the city, you've got all of these cool islands and people have their little cottages and homes, and it seems like everyone has a boat. It really is quite a lovely existence, I think, in the summertime.
Yeah, I think so too. Actually, Stockholm is in itself part of an archipelago. It's based on 14 islands. It's right at the straits between the third biggest lake in Sweden and the Baltic Sea. Kind of was founded as a watchtower originally to check trade going into the lake. So essentially, anywhere you go, you're going to find more islands, right? And Sweden is the country in the world with the most amount of islands as well. So it's very island heavy. I've heard it called Venice of the North, to the chagrin of a lot of Italians, I guess, but still.
I always laugh when I hear these comparisons like this. We were just in a city in Portugal called Aveiro, and they call it the Venice of Portugal. And I'm like, don't call it the Venice of this or the Venice of that. Let it be the Stockholm of Stockholm, let it be the Aveiro of Aveiro, and let it stand or fall on its own merits, because it's a beautiful place. Why does it need a comparison to a different place? But I think that's just me.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the neighborhoods in the city of Stockholm. And the one I want to start with is, and you're going to have to help me out here, Vincent, because obviously I don't speak Swedish and my pronunciation is probably going to hurt your ears. But so I'll just try to mangle through it and you can correct me. But Södermalm is sounds like a really cool neighborhood. Tell me about it a little bit.
Yeah, not far off. Södermalm is actually a pretty large part of Stockholm. So I mentioned before that Stockholm is based on 14 islands, right? And Södermalm is one of those islands. It's just south of Old Town, and used to be this very blue-collar working class area, farms up until the 1700s, and after that, lots of industries, etc. But in the last 50, 60 years, Södermalm has changed a lot and become this kind of hub for a lot of culture in general, everything from arts to of course, food and wine, which we're focusing on today. So yeah, and Söder, as I said, it's relatively big. It's easy to navigate because if you go in the wrong direction, you're going to end up by the water, and then you can just turn around. But certain parts of it are, of course, more kind of lively than others, especially one area called Katarina Sofia is very, very nice, I think. There's a lot of great restaurants and, nice bars and things like that. Also walking like pedestrian streets that they just close off for traffic completely. So you can just walk around and hang out,
I've never been to Sweden. The closest I've gotten is a short trip to Norway. Sweden is definitely a place that I want to go. Also Denmark, because I have some Danish heritage. But the one takeaway that I had being in Norway was how expensive things were, especially for alcohol. And some of the things the Norwegians told me was, well, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll start the evening at home, have a couple of drinks there before we go out, because drinking out is so darn expensive. Do you have the same idea there in Stockholm?
To a degree, I would say. But I have to say that even Swedes think that Norway is very expensive. It's just a very expensive country. That being said, Stockholm is definitely not a cheap city. I think a lot of people do drink at home before they go out. It's a very common thing, like a pre-party, we call it, a förfest in Swedish. And I think that's partially because of prices, because, of course, buying alcohol is cheaper, just like anywhere, but it's actually even more cheap here because, in comparison, because it's all governed by the state. So we have a state monopoly on alcohol, as in Norway and Finland and certain, provinces in Canada and some states in the US as well. And they control the prices, so you're never going to be kind of scammed, if you say. And they buy very large volumes, so it tends to be a little cheaper. Saying that, going out for a beer might cost you somewhere between 5 and 10 euros, depending on the place. I don't know what people are used to, but that's kind of the ballpark.
That's not outrageous. It would be outrageous in Portugal, but it's not outrageous compared to the US, I don't think.
I agree. But I do want to give your listeners kind of a red flag here, if they're planning on a trip to Stockholm or Sweden in general, is that we have an inclinational alcohol tax, I think, where it's essentially taxed heavier if it's stronger alcohol. This is supposed to deter people from drinking like heavy spirits, which used to be a big problem in Sweden back in the days, right? So, for example, buying a shot or a cocktail will probably be much more expensive than buying a beer when you're out. So a shot might cost you like 15 euros, which might sound insane to people, whilst a beer will be like 5. Okay.
Yeah, that is a little bit of sticker shock. Vincent, you're a sommelier, and I don't necessarily equate Sweden with wine, but tell me about your experience as a sommelier in Sweden.
Right. So this might actually shock a lot of people here, I think, but Sweden is actually a wine country. And I don't necessarily mean that from a production point of view, although I can talk about that as well, because that's happening. But Sweden is the only country in Northern Europe that consumes more wine than beer or strong spirits. I think most people think about beer or maybe even, for example, vodka, because of Absolut Vodka, for example, when they think of Sweden. But people here drink a lot of wine. We were very early with the bag in the box, so that doesn't mean that everyone drinks great wine, but people drink kind of a lot of wine. So there is a large market for sommeliers or just working with wine in general here in Sweden. And I think people in Stockholm are very interested. In the last 20 years, there's been a large wine boom. Now I feel like you have a wine bar on every street corner, more or less. Everything, of course, from natural wine bars to more conventional wine bars, and people are really exploring new kind of parts of the world, new flavor profiles and stuff. On top of that I mentioned before, Sweden in itself is also a very quickly growing wine industry. So today, Sweden is the largest producer in Northern Europe, except for Germany and England. I think we have about 85 producers last time I looked. Most of them are quite small, but still, there's some real serious investment going into viticulture here in Sweden.
You know, it's interesting because with climate change, you may be seeing more grape growing there. You may even be growing red grapes there before too long.
Yeah, we do actually. So it's a combination of two factors. It's climate change, of course, that helps out a lot. Maybe one of the few places in the world where that's a boon to agriculture. And on the other side, we also kind of tend to not care so much about wine convention. That's strong in the rest of Europe, especially in France and Italy. So they will, for example, only use purebred Vitis vinifera, the common wine plant, whilst a lot of viticulture in Sweden implements hybrids, like in Canada or some parts of the US where it's colder as well, which are just much more resilient. So that's the kind of direction it's going.
Fascinating. Just one more question about wine. What is the most common grape that is grown there?
So the most common grape is a grape that I think most of your listeners probably haven't heard about. It's called Solaris. And it's one of these hybrid grapes. It's actually a great grape, I think. It has a lot of these kind of Riesling notes, so very like fresh and elegant, limey, green apple, can have a lot of acidity. So a lot of producers tend to like put them on what's called malolactic fermentation. You kind of mellow out the malic acid into lactic acid to kind of soften them a little bit and things like that. So you might have to do some tricks, but a good Solaris can be a very, very nice wine.
I don't think I'm going to find any Swedish wine in my local Portuguese bottle shop. That just means I'm going to have to come up to Sweden and try a little with you. So there's that. While we're on this topic, let's go to beer, because craft beer is exploding all over the world. I was talking to a gentleman from Seoul, South Korea just the other day, and he was telling me about the craft beer scene there. And, it's happening everywhere. It's even starting to happen here, surprisingly, in Portugal, one of the biggest wine growing and wine drinking places in the world. So how's it going in Stockholm when it comes to craft beer, Vincent?
Yeah, it's, yes, as you say, as explosive as everywhere else, I think. There's craft beer on every corner. Today, actually, I was listening to an interview with a female football player for the team I support here in Stockholm called Hammarby. And she was mentioning that her family was starting a brewery as well. They have nothing to do with beer at all. It's just, that's the trend right now. Everyone has their own brewery in a cellar or something like that. And actually, even my co-host for the food tours that we do here in Stockholm has a tiny brewery in a cellar.
Oh, nice.
Very different from how beer manufacturing has been done in Sweden before. Sweden was and still is, of course, to a large degree, a big beer country. And given our vicinity to Denmark, which is also a very large beer country, I mean, yes, the normal yeast that you use for brewing is called Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, after Carlsberg, right, which is a Danish brewery. So there's a lot of lager influence here. And Stockholm was very much like based on these very large breweries, which you can still see the buildings of. Nowadays, they're more like party places or you might find a club in there, or you have some kind of venue or event hall or something. But there are these huge breweries all over the city, and that's kind of gone away in favor of these smaller producers.
What would be like one craft beer brewer that we should look for when we come to Sweden? Is there one favorite that you enjoy?
There's so many, to be honest. And I think it depends a lot on what you like.
Sure.
But I actually live very close to a brewing company that I really like. It's called the Carnegie. So it's Carnegie Bryggeriet in Swedish. And it's actually a collab between an old Swedish brewery and Brooklyn Brewery in New York. And they make some really, really nice beer in southern Stockholm. Everything from, Keller beer to IPAs and New England style IPAs and APAs and everything, porters. So that's a nice place to go. It's also a nice brewery visit that's very accessible for people. You don't have to travel to the middle of nowhere, and it's not also so small that you actually can't go there, There's also another place that I want to mention as kind of a little bit of a contrast called Omniopoyo's Hut. And this one is maybe difficult to spell out for listeners or even for you, but I think they can find it in the link later. Anyways, that's another brewery that does more Belgian style beer. So if you're into that, triples or Trappists or Lambic beers, they do those kind of beers in Stockholm. And they have a place that serves great pizza too.
Oh, great. Pizza and beer, can't go wrong.
Yeah, right.
Here in Portugal, there's a really good brewer in Lisbon called Dois Corvos, Two Crows, and they do I don't know, not standard, but regular craft beer, IPAs and porters and things of that nature. But they also tend to do occasionally some very unusual flavors. And I'm thinking off the top of my head, at one point he did a pastel de nata beer, which is the custard tart here in Portugal. So it's kind of creamy and vanilla-y in flavor, which, is off the wall, not something that you would think of off the top of your head. Is there any kind of that experimentation going on in Stockholm?
Definitely. There's one particular brewery that I just know on top of my head called Pang Pang. So Ping. And I think they're located in Stockholm, but I can't promise you. They're at least close to Stockholm otherwise. And they do all these crazy beers. We in Sweden, we love our pastry. We might talk about that later with the fika culture, and they had an entire line of fika beer. So it's like cinnamon bun beer and chocolate bar beer. And they also do tons of different fruit beers. I think their most famous one is called Mango Fever or something like this.
Nice. I like it. Got to sample that. Let's talk now about some of the food, some of the specific Swedish food that you can get in Stockholm. And I'd like to start this conversation. We'll talk about specific dishes shortly, but I'd like to start under the umbrella of the new Nordic cuisine because, about 15 years ago or so, this was the hot trend, and it remained very hot for several years. And I'm just wondering, during that time, has new Nordic cuisine changed at all? When you think of something new, maybe it evolves over time, or becomes less popular and something else takes over in its place. I'm wondering what the status is of new Nordic cuisine today in Sweden.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think it's changed in a way where it's maybe become a little bit more open for everyone in a way. When it was founded in 2004, or like the idea, the New Nordic referendum by a bunch of famous cooks, the most famous Swedish cook is called Magnus Nilsson, who's not from Stockholm, but still, they all decided that what are the things that we want to achieve here? Well, we want to have, essentially like an idea of seasonality, farm to table, and still fine dining at the same time. And I think that's what was really revolutionary, that they used what the land had. And I think New Nordic doesn't have to be Nordic. It can really be done anywhere. But of course, the produce we have here is more unique because of the severe climate and everything. So that might, put its imprint on the food. But that's essentially what it is. And I think maybe New Nordic has gone from being exclusively something you'll find in a 3-star Michelin restaurant to something that is more commonly seen around and maybe not marketed as necessarily New Nordic. I think if you go to a nice wine bar or a good restaurant, a lot of them now will be very, cognizant of where does their produce come from? Is it in season? What are they doing with it? So if it's the winter, what do they have to ferment to, be able to eat it? Because here we only have essentially, potatoes and cabbage in the winter. So all these other things, how do you have those flavors still? So yeah, I think it's become more available for people. So I think that's very nice. Otherwise, I think the general idea is about the same.
So I guess we can't maybe define New Nordic in terms of specific dishes, but maybe could you give me an example of a place where we would go, and you say it's more accessible now, maybe an accessible place where visitors can go and get an idea of what New Nordic cuisine actually means? Sure.
As I said, I think there's a lot of different places where one could go and try New Nordic cuisine to some degree or another. I have a favorite restaurant called Lilla Ego. It's quite hard to get a table sometimes, so it might be good to book in advance. But it's very nice, and they always do dishes in seasons, and with local great produce from small producers around, and they do really fun creations with the dishes. And at the same time, they're trying to make it accessible, which I think is another, almost in a way, pillar of New Nordic cuisine nowadays. It's like it should be easy to eat right, from both an environmental and a gastronomic point of view. So they're not overcharging, and they still have an a la carte menu. So I would really recommend going there, for example, if you just want to try a lighter version of it. Otherwise, of course, you have a lot of great restaurants you can find in the Guide Michelin. Everything from Franzén to Waxen, for example. but that's pretty easy to find, I think, as a tourist on your own.
Vincent, you study marine foods and sustainability. What changes are you seeing being made to increase sustainability regarding fish and sea life in general?
Right. So actually, my background is in more agriculture. So I studied gastronomic sciences and agronomy for my bachelor's, and I decided to move into marine food systems for the sake of like finding a pragmatic solution for food sustainability. That's both food safety and sovereignty, and of course something that I care a lot about, like good flavors as well. And I think that's a push that a lot of people are doing right now. We're kind of gridlocked a lot in the EU in terms of the politics. So all these dream ideas that people still have and had maybe more before about, on land permacultures where there's 2 chickens and a cow and some amazing produce and it all works in a circle are kind of, I don't want to call it being debunked because it's definitely something that's happening and is a valuable thing, but it's maybe not easy to imagine on the scale that it needs to be in the coming future. So in that view, a lot of people are turning to aquatic products and doing so in different ways. Now, a lot of the producers in Sweden, and I think Norway and Iceland as well, for example, at the moment tend to look at marine foods as something that you kind of infuse or implement into other foods for like sustainability or nutritional reasons. So you will find like a cracker with about 10% algae, things like that, right? But at the same time, there's another push where people are really trying to explore the new flavors of the sea. And I think that's something that you're seeing even more in these restaurants that we just talked about before, the new Nordic approach, because it's something that's available year round. Algae actually grows really well in winter. And we've started to kind of discover that algae is this amazing world. There are like 13,000 varieties of algae or species, I should say, and they're all edible and they're incredibly varied. Like a green algae and a red algae are more genetically different from one another than like a monkey and an insect almost. So you find all types of flavors. Yes, recently I tried this algae called sea truffle, which actually tastes like white truffle, like white alba truffle. It's
No
really
way.
amazing. Yeah, it's so cool.
Oh, man. I'm a huge truffle guy. You don't know this, Vincent, but I wrote a book. My novel is about truffles. And so when you say truffles, especially white truffles, I'm like, holy cow. Where does this come from? What is it exactly?
So this particular seaweed is a little bit hard to come by nowadays.
Of course, because it's a truffle. Luckily, you don't need a dog to find it, probably.
Right. It doesn't necessarily have to be. And this is why I think the marine sector is so interesting, right? Because there's all this potential. We don't know anything already, and we have like not really even conceived of it as a food system up until now. So we have all these possibilities in developing new things that we can grow. But as of this point, it's not possible to grow this. It's actually a parasite on another algae. So there's this algae called Laminaria digitata that grows along the coast of Norway. Up in the north, also sometimes in Sweden, but Sweden doesn't have a very large Atlantic coast. And at some times of the year, this other red algae will kind of attach itself to this digitata, and you'll get it kind of looks like a sponge almost. And you pick it, and you can dry it, and then you can like grate it into olive oil, and it just has this amazing aroma.
That is fascinating. Because not only are they calling it sea truffle because maybe it tastes like truffle, but it has some of the properties of truffle, of white truffle too. It's not able to, commercially cultivate it, and it's a parasite. Truffles aren't specifically parasites, but they do work in conjunction with the roots of trees in order to grow. So the spores are sort of like a parasite in a way. So there are other similarities with truffles there. That is fascinating.
I think even like, as we talk about truffle, why does it smell so much? And they talk a lot about infochemicals and things like that. And people are hypothesizing that it might be similar reasons that these truffles or this sea truffle smells so much. Like, why is it so volatile? It's essentially it communicating with things around it. It's really cool.
When people talk about sustainability, when it comes to the ocean, usually they're talking about fishing. and, actual animals. But it sounds like what you're saying is we're going to make it sustainable through sea vegetation.
That I think is very right, Brent. I mean, it's a very big topic. I could talk about this for 4 hours potentially, and it'd still be slightly hard to understand. But the general idea is that I don't know if you know or your listeners know about the trophic scale. You talk about like different animals having different levels of consumption. So the energy it takes for a salmon to grow is much, much more than it takes for, like, for example, an algae to grow. So as you move down these levels, things just become much more energy efficient. So we're saying, okay, we need to feed, a salmon 2.4 times its weight in the mass of a smaller animal for it to grow, one mass. So 1 kilo of salmon is 2.3 kilos of something else. That's, 5,000 kilos of something else. So we just move down this ladder, regardless if it's, bivalve, as in mussels or clams or whatever. We get a very, very efficient food system in general. So that's one way of looking at it. And I think, of course, fish are still, I love fish personally, and it's always going to be a part of diets, I think. But it's nice to see this kind of substitution. And I think this idea of changing, not necessarily removing things dogmatically, we're going to never eat meat again, but changing the proportions and the origins of things is very in vogue right now. There's a famous New York cook called Dan Barber who has a restaurant called Blue Hill Stone Barns in northern New York State, and they work a lot with this, and he coined the term the third plate, meaning that the second plate is just you've replaced the meat with an ecological meat. In the third plate instead, you're changing the proportions from the conventional plate model. So you have more vegetables, and you might have a little bit of fish or a little bit of meat to give taste to the other things on the plates. And I really vibe with that idea personally.
Let's talk about a few Swedish dishes specifically, and the one I want to ask you about first, this one is for my buddy Rick, who's German, and he loves herring. We make a joke with him that he's going to have a cabinet in his house that's locked, that his kids can't get into, that's going to be filled with herring. So
right.
I know that herring's a big deal in Sweden. Tell me about that a little bit, especially the fermented herring.
Yeah, so herring is, as you say, a very big deal. The Baltic Sea was full of herring, so it's been a staple for Swedes for a long time. Sweden is also not really a rich country historically. Nowadays, Sweden is, of course, quite affluent. But if you go back to the 20s and before, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe. So people, ate what they could. And this is where the fermentation comes in as well. So herring you will find in tons of different variations. I think most commonly you'll find it pickled. That's what we eat for most of our holidays, and it's eaten throughout the entire country. And there's, 100 different flavors, and every year there are new flavors, et cetera, et cetera. But the fermented herring is its own story. And I think a lot of people assume that it's just pan-Swedish. Even Swedish people think that it's just a Swedish thing. So if you're from southern Sweden, you might say, oh, I'm not a true Swede. I'm not eating fermented herring, surströmming, which why you're not eating it is because it's incredibly stinky. It's like a durian fruit on steroids, right?
Okay.
So it's just incredibly, incredibly stinky, and it's for a lot of people hard to eat. But surströmming is actually a northern Swedish dish, so that's where they eat it the most, and we've kind of borrowed it down here to the south. And it's not something you eat year-round. There's a specific tradition or celebration for surströmming called a surströmmingsskiva. It's generally held in September. So a bunch of people get together, you eat it usually with some hard bread, some potatoes, some creme fraiche-ish. Creme fraiche, it's its own lactic bacteria, but it's similar to creme fraiche, and some dill and some chives. And you drink a ton of snaps, of course, to kind of survive the fish.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of people do that. I don't personally, because I don't have that tradition, although I've had surströmming a couple of times in my life.
I know that there's this other thing, the open-faced sandwich on rye bread, the smørrebrød. Sorry, I'm butchering that, of course.
No.
Would we have the surströmming on that as well, or is that a completely different thing?
Yeah, it is actually a different thing. And I would argue that it's not even Swedish.
Interesting.
You find it in Sweden for sure. And this kind of bread, we call it kavring here. It's like a slightly sweet, dark bread with rye. Usually there's some syrup and stuff. You find that everywhere for breakfast or, even with herring on it, for example, for midsummer or other traditions that we have here. But the idea of a smørrebrød is very Danish. So that's really their thing. They do these open-faced sandwiches with a lot of different toppings. So if you're going on a Scandinavian trip, you should probably try the smørrebrød when you're in Copenhagen and then go for the delicacies here in Stockholm that are, the Stockholm ones.
So what's your favorite delicacy of Stockholm when we come to visit you, Vincent?
That's hard. There's so many good ones. I think Swedish cuisine lacks a little bit of PR. Our biggest promoter is IKEA, which is, not great. It's like having your entire food culture be represented by Walmart or something.
Right.
It's like, meatballs for sure. That's an important dish. People eat it at home and it's an amazing dish. But there's a lot of other things as well. And I think to understand the Swedish kind of food in general, you have to kind of understand the palate. If you compare it to, for example, German food, which tends to be quite heavy and fatty, Swedish food is usually lighter. We have a lot of fresh herbs, so you'll find parsley and chives and dill in a lot of things. Dill especially is very prevalent. On top of that, there's usually a sweet sour element. So when you have meat, you usually have berries on the side, lingonberries, for example. And the fish that I mentioned before, the pickled herring, is usually pickled in sugar and distilled vinegar. So it also has this kind of sweet and sour element to it. And saying that, then the dishes that I like the most are these like light kind of maybe summery dishes. There's a lot of things you put on sandwiches. We call them röra, but it means mash if you translate it directly. But it's like a sauce-ish, a firm, like a tuna salad almost, but with other things, right? And there's one called gubbröra, which is just really amazing. It's boiled eggs and then egg yolks and then some creme fraiche. And then you have these particular Swedish fish that we call anchovies, but they're not actually anchovies, just to make things complicated. And chives and some other things, and you have it on top of bread. So that's great. And of course, also you can't miss the salmon. The gravlax, for example, is just really, really nice.
What about tacos? I don't put Sweden and tacos together. I lived in Austin, Texas for a while. We had lots of tacos down there. Didn't think I'd see tacos when I went to Stockholm. When I will go to Stockholm, I mean. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point to talk a little bit about what people actually eat here. You're in Portugal at the moment. In Southern Europe tends to be quite focused on its own cuisine for good reasons very often, right? But if you go to Rome, you tend to have 90% Italian food. And of course, there are good other restaurants, but maybe that's not, a huge deal. Stockholm, on the other hand, is much more international. So it's more maybe like London, for example, where people eat, Swedish food once or twice a week, or when they go out and eat, it's very rarely that you go to a Swedish restaurant. And more often you go to restaurants from other cuisines, right? And tacos, for some reason, I actually don't really know why, has become an insane staple in Swedish food or Swedish foodways in general, where there's a thing called Taco Torsdag, so Taco Tuesday, right? Where
okay.
I don't have statistics here, but it wouldn't surprise me if like 40% of the country ate tacos every Tuesday. It's not maybe necessarily a taco that would make a person in Mexico City happy. It's more Tex-Mex. So Austin, Texas, there you go. But yeah, go into a Swedish grocery store, make sure to stop by the 20-meter long taco shelf.
That is crazy to me. When we see a taco, I'm going to ask you some specific questions. What do we do? Do we do a tortilla that's flour-based or corn-based? And do we slather on some refried beans?
So I'm going to be honest here. And say that I'm not personally a huge fan of the Swedish tacos.
Okay.
They are not necessarily always incredibly exciting in terms of spices and things like that, quite mild. But a lot of people like them. So, but to answer your question, usually it's either hard shell and then with corn, right? Or it's a gringo. So not corn, like a wheat tortilla. Corn tortillas are like a novelty here right now for some reason. And of course, in Stockholm, which is a big city and has a kind of strong pulse, you're also going to find, more authentic Mexican restaurants, for example, where you'll get the like refried beans and, you know, everything that you would find on a street taco. But in the Swedish conventional taco, it's usually wheat tortilla and a corn hard shell and some ground beef, maybe some corn, some cucumber, some of this crème fraîche that I keep talking about called gräddfil, some salsa, some cheese, avocado.
I'm going to ask you to keep an eye on how this progresses over the years, Vincent, because I'm very curious to see if things change a little bit. Because you said the creme fraiche is going on there. That's similar to like a sour cream. That's very Tex-Mexy. But, you know, I'm wondering in the future sometime, is Swedish cuisine going to meld with tacos and we're going to see, I don't know, fermented herring tacos in Stockholm somewhere, or some kind of Swedish cuisine make its way into that taco shell?
I'm sure we would. And I think you could probably already find it, to be honest, at least some sort of fusion. But I want to say that like the taco thing is not something that I think you'd eat in a restaurant necessarily. It's definitely like a home food for people.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But it's an interesting thing. And I think the point that's interesting to make here especially is that Swedish cuisine is just a part of what I actually consider to be authentic Swedish food experience, right? So I don't want your listeners to come to Stockholm and feel that they only need to have, you know, herring and reindeer and meatballs and things like that. It's also totally fine to go. We have a great Thai diaspora, for example. Go to a great Thai restaurant. Go to a nice Chinese place. There's tons of good things to explore.
This is what I tell people about Portugal all the time, Vincent. It's like, oh, I want Portuguese food. Yes, you'll get great Portuguese food here. But guess what? Portuguese were notorious colonizers. And because of that, there's great Indian food here. There's great African food. And there's obviously terrific Brazilian food here. So all of that is represented. And you got to try it all to really understand what folks are eating here in Portugal.
Yeah.
Let's talk about coffee. I thought the Portuguese drank a lot of coffee. The Swedes, they're only second behind, I think, the Finns for coffee consumption. Tell me about this idea of fika.
Yeah. Swedes drink a ton of coffee. And I think it might have something to do with the length of the day in the winter, for example. So people find kind of ways to cope with this darkness, you know? And there is a word called mys, which is a verb. You can say we mysa, which is, yes, we are cozying. Like we are cozying together. We're doing something cozy. So this cozy factor is a very strong part of the culture. People here don't like fluorescent lights at all. No, it's candle lit all the time, you know? Lots of pillows. And then on top of this, people tend to have these kind of almost dates every day. Called a fika break. It's essentially like a date with your friends when you just sit down, or your coworkers, or wherever you are. You have a coffee, you might have a pastry, and you just chat and mys. You cozy for a little while. That's kind of a break in your day. And some people do several fika breaks in a day. So that might be why there's so much coffee. And another factor here is the fact that we don't really drink a lot of espresso. The main staple coffee here is filter, and it's what everyone drinks. And this might shock a lot of people, but filter coffee has more coffee and also more caffeine in it than espresso, because a lot of the caffeine is denatured with the high temperature and the pressure. So people actually get a lot of caffeine from the coffee, which is, you know, what you need when it's so dark. So you tend to drink quite a lot, and you have a kettle brewing all the time.
Oh my goodness. All right. My heart is already racing. So you said you have a sweet or a treat with it. What kind would we specifically have when we go on a fika?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe the richest part of Swedish food culture is actually the pastry. Swedish pastries, I think, are amazing. And they have a very unique taste to them because they're not usually overly sweet. And they're usually like based on bread dough, or at least some of them are. So there's a whole world to explore here. But if I have to name one particular pastry that is common with fika, and I think that you should really try, it has to be kardemummabulle. So it's a cardamom bun. And for you who've been to America and had like a cinnabon, for example, that's not the same thing. There's no glaze. It's less sweet. It's much more spice intense. So yeah. I really think you should give that a go, because that's a really, really amazing pastry.
Oh, I think I'd really like that.
Yeah, it's so good. look up a picture. There are also tons of different other treats, but in general, Swedish pastries tend to have kind of a lot of cinnamon or cardamom or cloves even. And the historical reason for this is that, spices used to be very valuable. I mean, that being in Portugal, maybe more than a lot of people, right? But the spice trade was this immense thing. And, the royal family ate spices, but Sweden was this kind of in the middle of nowhere, lowly populated, poor country. So they couldn't really afford spices. So when they actually could, it was later in the game. Most European monarchies had already moved on to other things, whilst the Swedish royalty was still eating spices because that was the thing in vogue. So it kind of stuck with us, I think. And now we're eating a lot of these kind of spices in our pastries.
Speaking of spices, you have a local liqueur called Snaps, and this has some spices in it as well. Tell me a little bit about this and how we would enjoy it, how it's made, and how we would enjoy it.
Yeah, I love Snaps. And to fully understand, Snaps is a big category of alcohol. There's tons of different kinds of Snaps. And the first thing, it's not schnapps. It's not the German schnapps, which has like fruits or prunes and stuff. This is a dry alcohol. It has no sweetness and usually has different spices, right? And it's a food beverage. So you drink the schnapps with your horses. It's essentially your pairing. And this is something particularly common to do during celebration. So midsummer, for example, is something we celebrate a lot here. We have other parties. I talked about the surströmming skiva before, for example. Even Christmas, we drink a lot of snaps. And you drink it with the food. And then when you drink it, you also have to sing a song. This is called a snaps song. So when you're sitting at a table in Stockholm, if it's a time of year when there might be a celebration, you might hear people just randomly start singing together, sometimes screaming together. And then they're singing a song to their drink before they drink it. And there are these thousands and thousands of snap songs. And my family has their own snap song, for example.
No way.
Yeah.
That's absolutely delightful. I love that. And so give me an idea of what, I'm not going to ask you to sing, Vincent. I'm not going to put you on the spot for that, but give me an idea as to what some of the lyrics are, if you can translate them in your head.
Yeah, they're usually quite ridiculous. They're always very inciting drinking more, right? So I can try to translate a short one here for you. For example, so there's one that goes, "Imagine if I had a small snaps glass with the drink down my throat. Imagine if I had a small snaps glass with the drink down my throat. I would pull it up and down so that it tastes like a lot of more snaps." And then it goes back. But you get the idea.
I love it. Oh man, this is making me book my ticket right now to go to Stockholm because this sounds like so much fun. One of the funnest places I ever went was in Croatia, where we years ago had Rocky, and it was a similar kind of experience. There wasn't as much singing. Well, there was singing. There was quite a bit of singing. But it's the same kind of idea, and we had so much fun there, and I think we'd have equally as much fun with you guys in Stockholm. Before I let you go, I did want to ask you, one thing that I always like to do when I visit a new place is bring home a souvenir, hopefully a food-based souvenir. And, you work at a place called Rot, which is a little local organic grocery. And I'm wondering, what are some of the Swedish specialty products that we could look for that we might be able to legally put in our suitcase and bring home with us?
Right. Yeah, there's a ton of stuff, to be honest. And most things that I think are very exciting come from the north, or maybe not based in agriculture. So a lot of wild forage products, for example. So just to name a few here, for example, pine sprouts. We pickle pine sprouts. There's pine sprout oil. It's amazing on for example, a steak tartare. You can get different types of fish roe that are actually pretty okay to go in a suitcase from Swedish fish in inland lakes. There is a lot of different berries and jams. And I really recommend you getting one jam in particular called cloudberry jam. It's this tiny orange, amazing tasting berry that only grows in the vicinity of the Arctic Circle and north of that. And they make really, really amazing marmalades from it. On top of that, I think there's a lot of delicacies that people might not associate with Sweden directly, but that I wish people would try more. For example, cheese. Sweden is really historically a great cheese country because we have this immense forest that's just constantly pushing, all kind of pasture land aside. So for people to be able to have agriculture, you needed cattle because it kind of clears the land, right? So the cattle are actually, they're part of making food production work, and they're also good for biodiversity. So we've had a lot of cattle and a lot of different local cheeses. But then in the 60s, as you might know, Sweden's had a slightly socialistic, I don't know what to call it necessarily, social democratic agenda. And in the 60s, there was a lot of concentration of companies and production. So they removed a lot of these cheeses and standardized it. But nowadays, since the 80s, a lot of these small cheeses are popping back up again, and they're really, really great. The milk is amazing. It comes from heritage breed cows sometimes, if you know what you're looking for. And it can have this kind of alpeggio cheese taste where you have you can really taste the flowers in the milk. And there's tons of different versions, everything from blue cheese to, something that seems like a comté, etc. So keep your eyes out for some nice Swedish specialty cheeses too.
We have to swap cheeses because I think Portugal's not well known for their cheese either, but the Atlantic islands called the Azores makes amazing cheese. So we gotta pump up the cheese in the Azores. We gotta pump up the cheese in Sweden so that more people know about this great stuff.
Nice, yeah.
Well, Vincent Marcus from Food Tours Stockholm, thank you so much for being on the program today. This has been not only fun, but also enlightening, stuff I did not know about Sweden and about Stockholm. Folks can reach you at foodtoursstockholm.se. I'll have a link in the notes for them to contact you to do a food tour. But thank you so much for being here. It's just been a delight. And I'm going to have to learn some more Swedish drinking songs before I come up there to visit.
Yeah, it's a must. Thank you so much, Brent, and everyone listening. It's been great. I hope you come to Stockholm and give us a visit.
Okay. Snaps songs. I got to go to Stockholm for that alone. You can reach Vincent and book a food tour with Food Tours Stockholm at foodtoursstockholm.se. That would definitely be time well spent. Well, that's it for this week. And guess what? This has been our 300th episode of Destination Eat Drink. 300. Never thought I'd be doing this for almost 7 years, but this podcast has been incredibly rewarding because I get to talk to people like Vincent and folks like you listen to the show. If you want to drop me a line, you can do so at destinationeatdrink@gmail.com. And if you can support Destination Eat Drink at buymeacoffee.com/destinationeatdrink, I would be forever grateful. Next week on the show, it's some of the best markets like Bordeaux, Seville, Saigon, even Melbourne, Australia. Don't miss that. Until then, I've got lots of new stuff at destinationeatdrink.com. I just posted a complete foodie travel guide to the amazing wine city of Arrow in Spain. You can read that at destinationeatdrink.com/Arrow. That's Haro. I also just posted a brand new video about the small Portuguese city of Mafra, famous for the extravagant palace in the center of town and home to some great food as well. You can watch that by clicking on the video tab at destinationeatdrink.com, or you can go to my YouTube channel at Destination Eat Drink 946. Destination Eat Drink is distributed by the Radio Misfits Podcast Network and Ed Silla. Thanks, Ed. I'm Brent Peterson. I'll see you down the road.
Join us next week for another culinary adventure on Destination Eat Drink, a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.